Good afternoon, EDH enthusiasts. I'm the Planeswalker Project, and welcome to another Commander deck tech. If you can tell, I've been having a blast, pun intended, building decks using the cards from the Universes Beyond Fallout set. We've played around with the Mothman and the Master Transcended, and now I want to explore a Commander deck that's been generating quite a bit of buzz. Mr. House, President and CEO, is from Fallout New Vegas and is a central character to that game. In the Magic universe, he is a 0/4 legendary artifact human for 3 mana, 1 pip each of red, white, and black. Whenever you roll a 4 or higher, you create a 3/3 colorless robot artifact creature token. If you rolled a 6 or higher, you instead create that token and a treasure token. Finally, for 4 mana, you can tap him and roll a 6-sided dice plus an additional 6-sided dice for each mana from treasures spent to activate this ability. This is a dice rolling deck and something rather unique in the Commander landscape. Mr. House's ability doesn't specify what kind of die we need to roll, so I'll be capitalizing on cards that require you to roll dice, specifically the D20. Now, for the purposes of this video, we will be referring to these kinds of dice in the RPG dice terms. So D20 for 20-sided dice, D12 for 12-sided, D10 for 10-sided, D8, D6, D4, and D2. It's important to note that the spin down die included in many of the Magic the Gathering bundles are not legal D20s, as their sides are not numbered appropriately to function as a D20. Anyway, let's look at some of the cards that we'll be using to roll those dice. Ancient Copper Dragon and Ancient Gold Dragon are perhaps the most impactful and powerful of our dice-focused cards. Whenever they deal combat damage to a player, you roll a D20. The Copper Dragon will create you treasure tokens equal to the result, and the Gold Dragon will create us 1/1 blue fairy dragon creature tokens equal to the result. This can be a huge swing in value, but as with many of the cards that we will discuss in this deck, there is a high factor of chance that we have to take into account. This does, however, give us the greatest return on that risk. See, Mr. House's ability will give us an additional D6 to roll for each treasure that we use to pay for its ability. And so if we can continue to generate more treasure tokens to activate that ability, we'll be able to get more chances to get more treasures and robots. Chaos Channeler acts in a sense as our impulsive card draw engine. When it attacks, we roll a D20, and then depending on the result, we get to exile a number of cards from the top of our library, and then we get to play them this turn. Chaos Dragon is one of my favorites, and like many of the cards in this deck, offers some appropriate chaos to the game. It's a 4/4 with flying and haste, and has to attack each combat if able. At the beginning of combat on your turn, each player rolls a D20. If one or more opponents had the highest result, the Chaos Dragon cannot attack those players or planeswalkers they control this combat. It being a 4/4 with flying and haste on a 3-drop can be very difficult to interact with, and so your opponents will want to roll a high enough number to avoid getting hit. Delina Wild Mage is perhaps my favorite card in the deck, being a 3/2 elf shaman that has an attack trigger where you target a creature, then roll a D20. Depending on the result of the D20, if it's 1 to 14, you create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of that creature, except the token is not legendary and it has exiled this creature at the end of combat. If you roll 15 to 20, you create one of those tokens and then roll again. This can end up snowballing into getting you additional copies of your creatures, and since Mr. House wants those high die rolls, you not only can get token copies, but you can also get robots and treasures. Hoarding Ogre is perhaps the most synergistic card with our commander, giving us an attack trigger roll of the D20. The higher the result, the more treasure tokens that you can create. This helps fuel our commander's ability and can potentially be converted into more tokens. Clown Car is a nice mana sink if we have excess mana or treasures that we'd like to convert into dice rolls. When the Clown Car enters, you roll XD6. For each odd result, you create a 1/1 white clown robot artifact creature token. For each even result, you put a +1/+1 counter on the Clown Car. As we'll see later on, we actually have a way to manipulate our dice rolling results. Component Pouch is a bit of a wonky mana rock, relying on a component counter in order to give us 2 mana of different colors. The real value for this deck falls in its second ability, rolling a D20, and if its result is 1 to 9, you put 1 component counter onto the Component Pouch. If you roll 10 to 20, you put 2. I literally run this just to get the D20 roll. The mana production is just extra gravy. The Deck of Many Things is one of our win conditions, though it relies very heavily on having good luck and proper setup. For 2 mana, you can tap the Deck of Many Things and roll a D20. You subtract the number of cards in your hand from the result. If that result is 0 or less, you discard your hand. If the result is 1 to 9, you return a card at random from your graveyard to your hand. If the result is 10 to 19, you draw 2 cards. If your result is 20, you put a creature card from any graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. When that creature dies, its owner loses the game. To get a 20 as a result, you would really need to have no cards in your hand and roll a natural 20. But this would let you steal an opponent's creature, and then if that creature dies, they lose the game, making it critical that they protect their creature, even if it's on your battlefield. Treasure Chest is a potentially good card depending on your results. You can pay 4, sack the treasure chest, and roll a d20. If you roll a 1, you lose 3 life. Oops. If you roll a 2 to 9, which is the optimal choice, you create 5 treasure tokens. If you roll a 10 to 19, you gain 3 life and draw 3 cards, also a good result. Finally, if you roll a 20, you search your library for a card. If it's an artifact card, you can put it onto the battlefield, otherwise put it to your hand. This is perhaps the other best result because most of the best cards in our deck are a handful of high-powered artifacts. Speaking of high-powered artifacts, Vexing Puzzle Box is one of the best cards in the deck and is a 3-mana artifact. Whenever you roll 1 or more die, you put a number of charge counters onto the Vexing Puzzle Box equal to the result. You can tap the puzzle box to add 1 mana of any color and then roll a d20. You can also tap the puzzle box and remove 100 counters from the puzzle box to search your library for an artifact card, put it onto the battlefield, and shuffle. With how frequently this deck wants to roll dice, you will quickly hit the 100 counters on the puzzle box frequently, allowing for multiple tutors. Luck Bobblehead is another win condition in the deck, which is probably why we run so many artifacts and artifact tutors. We have all 7 bobbleheads in this deck, but the Luck Bobblehead cares about dice rolls. You could pay 1 and tap the bobblehead to roll XD6, where X is the number of bobbleheads you control. You create a tapped treasure token for each even result, and if you roll a 6 exactly 7 times, you win the game. This sounds like an incredibly difficult thing to do, especially considering you need to not only assemble all 7 bobbleheads, but you need incredibly good luck to roll 7d6 to have all 6 as the result. The actual probability of you rolling 7 dice and getting all 6s is 0.000357%. So, good luck. Or alternatively, you can utilize our next package of cards which are in the deck to manipulate our roll results. Will, Blade of Frontiers, lets you roll an additional dice whenever you roll, and you can ignore the lowest result. You can also put a +1/+1 counter onto Will whenever you roll 1 or more dice. Since we almost always will want the higher roll on our results, his ability will come in handy quite often. Xeno Squirrels enters with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. Whenever you roll a dice, you can remove a +1/+1 counter on the Xeno Squirrel, and if you do, you can increase or decrease the result by 1. This can be helpful if we want to get to a specific number, and it's one of the few ways in this deck to decrease the dice roll result. Barbarian class's base ability gives us more redundancy on what Will does to roll an additional dice and ignore the lowest result, giving us some better chances on getting those winning rolls. Its other 2 abilities have some value, as they give boons to our rolling of the dice, and can potentially turn into a haste enabler for our side of the battlefield. Night Shift of the Living Dead is an enchantment that lets you pay 1 life after rolling a dice, and if you do, you increase or decrease the result by 1. You can only do this once per turn. Also, whenever you roll a 6, you create a 2/2 black zombie employee creature token. There are some builds of this deck that feature the Unfinity attractions, and while I think that is a very fun mechanic that can even tie into the aesthetics of Fallout, I wanted to go more heavily on getting D20 rolls, whereas the attraction theme only utilizes D6 rolls. Our next section of the deck is called They See Me Rolling, They Hating, and whoever wrote that bit into the script is getting fired. But since we are aiming to make treasures based on our dice rolls, I figured the next section would be good to discuss the cards that will add value to our treasure production. Goblin Engineer has an enter ability that lets you bin an artifact card, and then you can pay 1 red, tap the Engineer, and sacrifice an artifact to return a target artifact with a mana value of 3 or less to the battlefield. We are running 7 bobblehead cards, and a slew of other artifacts that are all part of our various win conditions. They will be targeted by removal. With our little Gobbo friend here, we can actually use any artifact, including treasure tokens, to return them to the battlefield. Goblin Welder does about the same thing, letting us sacrifice an artifact to return another artifact from our graveyard to the battlefield. Hellkite Tyrant is an auto-include, given how many artifacts this deck is running, and if you're decidedly evil enough, you can steal your opponent's artifacts. Ingenious Artillerist has an ability that triggers whenever 1 or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control, dealing that much damage to each opponent. If you have a large quantity of treasures coming into play, that can singe an opponent for each treasure you create. Cold Oath of Forge Master is a nice way to turn your excess treasures into any artifact from your deck. I know that in certain contexts you won't want to sacrifice your treasures because you can use Mr. House, but I'd like to think that this deck will be making quite a few of them as your game progresses, and we can spare 3 to help tutor out our win cons. Oswald Fiddlebender is literally our birthing pod, lets us sacrifice an artifact to go fetch an artifact that costs 1 mana more. Turn a treasure into a soul ring into a talisman, and then a talisman into a bobblehead. Reckless Fireweaver burns opponent whenever an artifact enters our battlefield, so it's very similar to the Artillerist, just 1 mana cheaper. Descent into Avernus is such an underrated card in decks wanting treasures, as each turn you create 2 more treasures than you did last turn, and then you burn each player for 2 more damage than you did last turn. Yes, it puts a clock on the game, but sometimes you need to get ahead in games, and this'll do it. Revel in Riches is of course in here, being the most capitalist card in the deck. If you have all the treasure, you win. When your opponent's creatures die, you get treasure, and then you win. We generate treasure like nobody's business, and so this is a shoo-in as an alternate win con. And lastly, Zorn gives us additional treasure whenever we would create treasure tokens. The goal of this deck is simple: get out Mr. House, get rolling, and start generating value out of your dice rolls. The deck is dependent on luck, but going heavy on dice rolls will let us substitute quantity over quality, so if our luck is lacking, we can at least roll more dice to help compensate. And on the flip side, we can always hope for a little bit of bologna sandwich dice rolling. But anyway, that's going to wrap up this fun little tech. I hope you enjoyed it, and remember, likes and shares are the best way to help us avoid total atomic annihilation. If you're new here, remember to subscribe. I promise we won't put you in Vault 56. I appreciate you hanging out with us today, and as always, I'll catch you all next video.